Hi, I'm John Nunn, and today I'm going to talk about the book Understanding Pawn Endgames, which was recently published by Gambit Publications. The author is Valentin Bogdanov, who's a Ukrainian international master with a lot of experience in coaching top Ukrainian players. He's written an interesting book on pawn endgames. It takes a slightly different approach to many other books on this subject. It focuses on the type of mistakes which people tend to make in king and pawn endings. He's chosen well over 200 practical examples in which very strong players mainly make mistakes in king and pawn endings, and that's not to poke fun at their errors, but to try to draw conclusions about the type of things which people overlook in what might appear to be simple endgames. Now, this book is available in 3 different forms. If you want the print version, you can only get it directly from Amazon. If you want the Kindle version, that's also of course an Amazon thing. And finally there's the app version, which uses Gambit's own app, Chess Studio 2, and that's the app I'm using to show off the material from the book today. Well, let's take a look at the first of the 3 positions I've chosen for you. It's white to play in this position from my 1996 game, and you can see that there are 2 plausible moves for white. White can either push his h-pawn to try and promote as quickly as possible, or he can take time out to take the pawn with king takes f3. Okay, you can pause the video now and try to work out which of these 2 moves you would play. Okay, let's see if you got it right. What actually happened in the game was that white decided to push his pawn as quickly as possible, and black of course pushed his a-pawn. White can't move his king across to stop the a-pawn because then the f-pawn would be released. So both sides just rushed forward with their pawns and promoted at the same time. After this check, a draw was agreed. The black queen on a1 defends the pawn on e5, so there's no reaching a queen and pawn against queen ending. So the draw is entirely justified. Now it may be, if we now go back to the original position, that white thought there was nothing better. But perhaps a little bit surprisingly, the position is winning for white, and the winning move is to take the pawn. It looks unlikely because the king moves away from the enemy a-pawn, but white does actually have time to take the pawn and bring the king back to try to stop the black a-pawn. Now it turns out that he can't actually stop it, but he can force the black king to advance into a position where it's badly placed, for example, allowing white to promote with check. Now there are a couple of important points which justify what white has done. And the first is that if black brings his king over to the king side to try to stop white's pawn, white simply pushes his pawn to h5, and the black king is unable to do anything here at all because the square f5 is controlled by the e4 pawn. Now white just brings his king over to the queen side and captures the a-pawn and wins easily. So after king takes f3, if black simply pushes, this doesn't help either. The white king is still in the square of the a-pawn, so the king comes across and stops the pawn, and then white wins on the king side by advancing his own pawn. So the only thing that black can really do is to move his king forward so as to shoulder away the white king and stop it from coming over to block the enemy a-pawn. Now white plays here, threatening again to sneak across in front of the pawn, and now black has to move his king either to b3 or to c3 if he wants to cut off the white king by meeting king d1 with king b2. Well, king b3 looks bad, and it allows white to win by, well, let's just have a look. White wins this variation because his g-pawn promotes with check. Here we go, and white promotes with check and then wins very easily. So it might look better to put the king on c3 instead, which also means that king d1 can be met by king b2, but it turns out that this is also bad. White again pushes, but this time when black takes on g6, white doesn't take back but plays h6 instead, and it turns out that when both sides promote, white has a skewer winning the enemy queen. Now, that's a slightly tricky point, but the idea of drawing the enemy king into a position where white has a skewer or promotes with check or there's some other defect is actually quite a common one in king and pawn endings. So it's well worth knowing that moving your own king so as to force the enemy king or drag it into a bad position is a very common motif, and it's one that's actually quite easy to overlook. So let's have a look at the second position. This is from a rapid game, Kasparov Asmai-Prashvili. Well, it's black to play here, and he actually only has one move to draw. Well, once again, you can pause and think about the position and see if you can find the drawing move. Well, this is a little bit more complicated. I should say that the author has adopted a style where he talks very much in general terms. He does give some concrete variations, but he prefers instead to explain the general principles behind the position and then give just maybe the main line and one or two subsidiary variations. So if you want to work out the rest for yourself in detail, you can, but in many ways it's more important to understand the general principles than to be faced with a forest of variations. So, in order to understand the logic here, let's imagine that the kingside pawns have been arranged in such a way that neither side has a tempo move. So we assume that some pawn moves have been played on the king side and the pawns are locked and there are no tempo moves. Well, if it's black to play then it's a straight draw, because black just plays his king to c6, and after king a7, king c7, he has the opposition and there's nothing white can do. But on the other hand, it's different if for example, I now just play a random move and white gains the opposition. Again, I'm assuming that all the tempo moves on the king side have been exhausted. Now black has to play here, and white sneaks around the back with his king, and, well, b5, white can either take or play a5, but let's just assume he plays king c5, white plays king c7, and now it doesn't matter whether black plays b5 and there's a pawn exchange, because in this position a5 might win as well, or black plays king b4, white takes and black takes. We end up in a position in which the black king is one file to the left of the white king and it's white to play. And there's no way black can avoid that situation from arising. So now the kings head to the king side, and everything depends on the way the pawns have been arranged on the king side. And like it is right here, the position is very favourable for white, because he takes the pawn on g6, black takes the pawn on f4, and then white takes the pawn on h5. So white takes off two pawns and black only takes off one pawn. So white would then have an extra passed pawn, passed h pawn, and the extra pawn would win easily. So everything depends on how the kingside pawns are arranged. We've already seen how unfavourable it is for black to have the pawn structure f5, g6, h5, because white takes two pawns with his king. And in fact, it's even worse when the pawn is on f6, because white can take the whole lot. So what black has to do is black has to play his pawn to h4, so that after white takes on h6, it takes white an extra move to approach the h pawn. So he needs to play his pawn to h4 and his other pawn to f5. So that he has the formation f5, g6, h4. Then white takes on g6, black takes on f4, and then if white plays king h5, black can play h3 and he gets a passed f pawn. Okay, that's all a little bit abstract. But let me just show you what happened in the game and then the drawing line. So first, what happened in the game is that black made the mistake of moving the king first, and what Kasparov was very quick to pounce on this mistake. He played h4, preventing black from setting up the optimal pawn structure and making sure that black cannot move the pawn from the vulnerable h5 square. So what happened now was here, white has to use this reserve tempo with the g pawn, otherwise he can't gain the opposition on the queen side. And, well, white came like this, and we have the situation where Well, actually, this may appear to be slightly more favourable than what I was saying, but it ends up to be a win for white anyway, because after this there's a standard trick which occurs very often in these situations where the kings are eating each other's pawns. White doesn't take one of the black pawns, because black could then take one of white's pawns, but he instead plays his king to g5 and puts black in Zugzwang. And now if black king goes this way, white takes this pawn, and if black goes this way, white takes this pawn. So white ends up taking a black pawn without losing any pawns of his own, and then wins easily, of course, by pushing a pawn and promoting it. So black's first move, playing his king to c6, like this, was a mistake because it allowed white to change the structure on the king side favourably. So now look at what happens if black plays the correct first move, which is to play h4. Okay, white plays king a7, black plays f5. Now that's the most favourable pawn structure for black on the king side. White can now only take one pawn with his king. White plays h3, he has to do this in order to gain the opposition on the queen side. So in fact, in order for white to win, he has to have two things happen. He has to gain the opposition on the queen side, and he has to have a favourable pawn structure on the king side. Now because of the way the pawns are arranged on the king side, white can always gain the opposition, but by playing the correct first move, black has prevented white from getting the second winning precondition, which is the favourable pawn structure on the king side with the white pawn on h4. Now it's a draw. The sequence of moves. White tries to shoulder away the black king, but it doesn't help. And now, well, actually, white has to be a little bit careful not to lose here. But after this, it all comes out to be a draw. Black has to find one more good move after g4. He mustn't take. He must instead play king e5. And now if the pawns are exchanged on f5, of course it's a straight draw. And after g5, black plays f4, king here, and now the pawns rush forward for promotion. But queen and pawn against queen with a rook's pawn is a fairly comfortable draw when the pawn is so far back. And in addition, black's king is not badly placed here, so he shouldn't have too much difficulty reaching a draw. So this would have been the correct outcome, draw if black had found the most accurate continuation. Again, this was like a little bit of a subtle point, and one can hardly criticise players these days for making mistakes in these king and pawn endings, because with the current time limit, they're playing effectively at 30 seconds a move. Of course, this was a rapid game, but even in a standard classical time limit game, 30 seconds a move beyond a certain point, it's really easy to make a mistake in king pawn endings, and indeed in many other types of ending as well. Let me just show you the third position. And let's see this. Sasikirian against Feller. So to say, most of the examples in this book are fairly recent. They're from the 21st century, and certainly the vast majority of them were new to me. I hadn't seen them before, so it's not a case of the author rehashing the old classical examples. He's found quite a lot of modern material which is new and instructive. Well, here white has only one move to draw. Again, you might like to think about it. It is fairly tricky. So if you find the correct move in under 10 minutes, you're doing really well. Okay, let's have a look. Well, at first sight, it looks reasonable for white to resign, because this just looks like a classical outside pass pawn position. The white king has to stay on the king side to deal with the f pawn, and the black king moves over the queen side, gobbles up all the white pawns, and then promotes something. But funnily enough, the position's a draw, and there are two reasons for this. The first reason is that the f pawn isn't that far outside. If it were g pawn on h pawn, then in fact it would all be over. But with the f pawn, white can still possibly take the f pawn and get back to the queen side in time to draw. It's a bit like the first example I showed where white played king takes f3 and got his king back. It's kind of easy to underestimate the speed of the king. It only moves one square at a time, but that can be faster than you think. And the second point, which may save white, is that his pawns on the queen side are fairly far advanced. If he can push them forward and exchange off the black b pawn so as to leave black with only an a pawn, then he only needs to get his king back as far as c1 to make the draw. Well, I said this was a difficult position, and it is, and white played the possibly most obvious move. He played king e2. But now black played king e4, which is natural, and white played a5. This is actually the correct plan. It doesn't work in this precise position. White wants to play b5, and then he wants to try to exchange the pawns on the queen side. Now, normally you say pass pawn should be pushed, but in fact black doesn't want to push the pass pawn in this position because it actually makes it quicker for the white king to take it. It takes white longer to take the pawn when it's on f5 than when it's on f4. And also when white takes on f4, the king can easily get back to c1 along the diagonal route. It takes back on f5, it's much more difficult to get back in front of the likely prospective a pawn that black will get. Now at this point, black could have won. He could have played a6, and this prevents white from easily exchanging a pawn on the queen side, and this position actually is a Zugzwang position. If it were black, if black had to move again, it would be a draw, but if white's to play, it's a loss. It's what I call a reciprocal Zugzwang, in which neither player has a waiting move, and in situations of reciprocal Zugzwang, the result depends on who moves first. White actually moves, when he has to move first, must damage his position. If he plays c4, black can play king d4. The pawn move has allowed the black king to approach the queenside pawns very easily. If he plays king f2, then of course the black king comes into d3 once again, coming to gobble up the pawns. So the king has to go to d2. Now, however, pushing the pawn works, because after the king comes back to e2, black plays f3 checking king d3, and black actually takes all three queenside pawns with an easy win. Well, that variation should give you a hint as to the correct drawing move. White has to play not king e2, but king d2. He needs to triangulate with his king to lose the tempo so that the critical position arises with black to play. Now the author gives some variations here. He gives king g3, king f3. I won't go into that. I'm just going to talk about the critical line. If you want to play with those variations, you're welcome to, or of course you can buy the book. But the critical point is that after king e4, white plays a5. Now this is kind of slightly awkward for black because he doesn't want to push f4, so he plays a6 like he did in the line I was showing you, but now after king e2 it's black to move. So the only reasonable move now is to push the pawn, but now white's quick enough to swap off one pawn. And let's see how that works. King here, takes, king here, king here. And white gets to the drawing c1 square just in time. He's one tempo in time to get back to the drawing square. So if black had an extra tempo here, for example, if white had to take the pawn on f5 rather than f4, white king wouldn't be able to get back to c1 and black would win. So that's the critical point. Is you have to understand this position of reciprocal Zugzwang, and then you have to realise you must triangulate with the king to lose the tempo. Well, I've failed to mention one thing, was that black in the game, he had this winning position, but he made a mistake. Black also didn't realise the critical importance of playing a6 here and putting white in Zugzwang. He in fact pushed the pawn, and white got away with a draw in any case. Like this. Now he played the drawing move a6. If black plays b6, white can play c5, again exchanging the b pawn and saving the game. And if he takes here, it comes to very much the same thing. White king is in time. In this case, in fact, the white king is in plenty of time to get back and make a draw. Well, okay, this final position was one of the very more difficult ones in the book. I would say the standard of the examples is moderate to slightly high, but there's a lot of instructive material here. Positions all grouped in chapters according to the type of mistake which is made, which is a helpful piece of organisation by the author, enables you to study similar positions with the same motif. My preference would actually have been to reserve some of these positions as exercises, and that wasn't done, but of course there's nothing to stop you from covering up the analysis and looking at the position for yourself before you see the analysis that Bogdanov has provided. Well, it's a really interesting book, and I certainly enjoyed it. I love Endgames, as regular viewers of my YouTube videos will be well aware. And it's nice to see people writing instructive books about, well, in my opinion, one of the most elegant phases of the game. Well, thank you for watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you for the next one.